Thank you everyone for being here today. I want to start by thanking the Alliance to Save Energy for hosting this discussion as part of the EE Global webinar series. My name is Jamie Hall, and I work on energy and environmental policy issues for General Motors. I've been working in the electrification policy space for the past 12 years and think we're at a really exciting point in this broader EV market today. The product announcements keep coming, the vehicles are getting better and more capable, and GM alone has announced that we're going to spend $27 billion on EV and automation technologies in the next several years, bringing an additional 30 vehicles to market. Should state up front, working for a car company, you get used to this. I will not be making any product announcements today, but that said, from our CEO on down, the commitment to electrification is clear. We're working toward an all-electric future, and we're not alone. I think there's billions of dollars pouring in across industry, and over the next several years, you're going to see more and more and better EVs in all different shapes and sizes. But exciting as that may be, the vehicles are just one piece of the overall puzzle, and that's what makes this, I think, such an exciting area. The potential is tremendous, but it's really complicated, and we have a lot of work to do together with all of you, I think, to get to an all-electric future. We're here today to talk specifically about electrifying last-mile delivery. I think a lot of that, people immediately think of the vans that are doing deliveries for FedEx and UPS and Amazon, but really it's probably broader than that, depending how you might think about it. I mean, Uber drivers are doing last-mile delivery of meals, and you've got, I think, some forward-looking fleets thinking beyond vehicles to, electric bikes or other smaller technologies. I suspect we'll spend a lot of time talking about vans today, but just kind of want to put this in context that this sector is broad and diverse and changing. I think it's a really important and timely topic. To start with the obvious, COVID has led to an explosion in online shopping, and it just means there are more and more of these vehicles running around. It's kind of shining more of a spotlight on the challenges and the opportunity of electrifying this sector. And while the focus on last mile delivery electrification as an opportunity is growing, I don't think it's new at all. This has long been cited as a segment of the market that's relatively ready for electrification. You've got short stop and go routes that lend themselves well to the technology. A lot of these are return to base vehicles, which gives the opportunity for centralized fueling. And there are large, savvy, motivated fleets that dominate this space. So it's easier to see a near-term path for electrification here than it is for, a contractor with a pickup truck towing a heavy load and sort of going different places every day. But while there's been a lot of hype and there's a lot of excitement, I think we still clearly have a long way to go. This sector clearly is not electrified today. And I think most of us involved in this will generally agree that we're not going to get there until we have the right vehicle at the right price, and we can sort of work through thorny issues around infrastructure and the grid and just sort of making the overall business case work. I think policymakers are seeing and working to overcome these challenges. It's not surprising that California has been a real leader here, trying to look at this holistically and support the market. But you've got other states stepping up and potentially looking to follow California. The extent to which they can go all in, I think, is an open question. And now we have a new administration in Washington, and so there's certainly no shortage of ideas on how we may be able to move things forward at the federal level and the potential for leadership there. And it's not just policymakers. There are groups looking to move the ball forward all over the place. Many of them are represented here on the panel. So with that basic background, I want to turn to the speakers. We have a really great group of experts here today, all of whom are working on electrification at the intersection of the nonprofit, private, and government sectors, and all of whom have quite a lot of impressive experience in this area. I think the overall arching question for all of us today is sort of how do we collectively work to overcome the barriers and get to wide-scale electrification. I know you all work on these questions every day, so we'll jump in with Meredith right in the middle of her morning coffee. Meredith's got a long history of leadership on these issues in the public sector, having served as a special assistant to the Cal EPA secretary. She's also worked in the utility sector. And full disclosure, I used to work at CalSTART in Meredith's role, but I did not have her background to bring to the role. So she's really been able to do some some great things. So Meredith, hoping you can kick this off by telling us a bit about CalStart's work on these issues, why you see next mile or last mile delivery as kind of a beachhead market, if you will, and the major challenges and opportunities from your perspective.
Great. Thank you, Jamie, for the very kind introduction. Again, I'm with CalStart. We're a member-based 501c3 with offices all over the country. And we are, I'm very focused on California policy, but we're also really working to seed California policy across the nation and also across the world with our Global Drive to Zero program. And so in terms of the beachhead strategy, I think I have one slide we could look at together just to get a sense for what we're talking about. This is something that CalStart has developed with the Air Resources Board in California, and it goes into their 3-year investment plan and sort of informs policy, not only on the incentive side, but on the regulatory side. And so I just wanted to highlight where we see delivery vans being in this second wave. Transit buses, zero emission transit buses have been available and in use kind of for the longest, with some transit districts in California having hydrogen buses now for almost 10 years. And we really see the delivery van orders are picking up. And I think the main reason for that in many ways is, as Jamie alluded to, a drive cycle that's very friendly to electrification and a total cost of ownership with a payback period, to pay back the incremental investment to buy a zero emission delivery vehicle of being, we think in the range of 5 years or less, depending on your typical fuel costs, obviously, and electric rates. But, basically the beachheads go from here. And so the early movers being transit buses, delivery vans, and then moving into the heavier duty truck categories, where we see a few things being much further off, like long haul tractors, but these regional delivery trucks in that sort of 3rd and 4th wave category. So you can, that's all on this slide. But basically, we are seeing delivery van orders really pick up, full disclosure from CalStart members like Rivian and Arrival, and with the announcement of Ford to bring the transit van. In California, we see about 10,000 Class 2B and 3 delivery vans sold a year. So we think the potential, again, to impact that segment of the market is really great. And the fuel cost savings, very significant on an annual basis for a delivery fleet. So I think that's why FedEx, UPS, and Amazon are, placing these huge orders. But as you said, Jamie, there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that the orders can be delivered and that there's infrastructure in place to support them. And I know that in Europe, things may be moving a little faster in this segment. The vehicles have been available a bit longer, so we're definitely looking to them as leaders in this area. And I would say that we're focused not only on the beachhead for identifying, sort of which segments orders are going to be placed first, but also as CARB looks to developing things like fleet rules, actual fleet mandates, which we are supportive of as an important ecosystem of policies along with the sales mandate and the ACT. We think it's these early first mover categories that are the best suited to those kinds of rules today, especially those ones with high levels of corporate ownership. And so, really just think that the delivery sector, is going to make a big impact. We're all waiting with bated breath for these huge deliveries. And we feel that, this is a sector that can lead the others. One other innovative thing I wanted to mention is there are alternatives to vehicles, to powered vehicles, vans to deliver last mile packages. And we're seeing more and more use, especially in Europe, in places that have zero emission zones, of alternates to that. And CalStart is now part of a pilot project with FedEx in New York City to deliver packages using e-cargo bikes. And that's certainly something that we would like to encourage through policy in California and beyond, is when possible, let's deliver things with an even lower, carbon solution and lessen the impact to cities that are feeling such major impacts from all of these delivery vans parked everywhere. So I think that's it on that question, Jamie, and I'll let you turn to the next panelist.
Thank you. And quickly, for those who maybe spend less time in California policy circles than we do, a few acronyms. So CARB is the California Air Resources Board, which is a major regulator sort of pushing things forward in the space. And Meredith also mentioned the ACT, that's the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, which I imagine we may talk about later, which is a sales requirement for medium and heavy duty vehicles. It is placed on the manufacturers, and at the same time, the agency is looking at potentially putting in place fleet purchase requirements to go along with that. And they've also got a suite of other things, which I think we can talk about later in terms of infrastructure investments and working on electricity rates and upfront purchase incentives and things like that. So with that basic background for the non-California folks, we'll turn over to Carol Lee Ron, who is Senior Director of Transportation at Ceres. She's got 25 years of experience working with stakeholders across this sector on a wide variety of environmental issues, including some work with the state of Massachusetts. So it brings both the nonprofit and public sector experience to this discussion. So Carol Lee, would you mind talking a bit about Ceres, what it is that you do, how you work with investors, and in particular, I think one thing that's really relevant to this discussion is the corporate EV alliance that Ceres has created, and sort of hoping you can talk a little bit about what your partners in that group are seeing in terms of challenges and opportunities.
Sure, thanks, Jamie. And I think, you know, our partners and companies and investors share your optimism about this point in time and the transition to fleet electrification. As you mentioned, we coordinate the Corporate EV Alliance, or CEVA, and this was just launched last January. And we have 21 member companies, including Amazon, IKEA, and DHL, and they've all committed to transition their fleets to electric vehicles. And I'm happy to talk more about that later as well. Another couple pieces of our work that are germane here are our work with investors. And investors have been important drivers of electrification, actually. And that's because they recognize the economic disadvantages associated with climate risk and transition risk. And accordingly, they're pushing companies to adopt net zero goals, as well as those all-important interim goals. We coordinate the Climate Action 100 Plus network, and that's a global network of over 500 institutional investors with $52 trillion in assets under management. And they're engaging with 165 of the world's largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. And so when you think about a company that has a large transportation footprint, say a vehicle manufacturer or a large fleet owner, or even a company that has a large transportation footprint and moving its goods, once they set a net zero target and the interim targets, by definition, electrification is really the only way to go with their fleets to meet these climate goals. So that's been a very powerful driver as well. And of course, as we're seeing more interest among companies in electrifying their fleets, we've been able to bring business support to these strong policies driving electrification. For example, the Advanced Clean Truck regulation in California that you and Meredith had alluded to. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to expand on any of those.
Great, thank you. Just keep going through intros and then dive into some questions. So next we'll go to Ben, who is National Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Electrification Coalition and has worked in a number of roles across the country on electrification and other environmental issues for a long time. I definitely personally see Ben as a leader in this space, and I'm excited about what the Electrification Coalition is doing. So Ben, can you tell people a bit about your role in this space, your role at the Electrification Coalition, and in particular, an overview of some of what you're doing in your freight electrification initiative?
Happy to, and always enjoy the opportunity to talk with such a great panel of experts, and really appreciate the pulling this panel together. I think this is this is sort of like the cool kids discussion. Freight is like the new on electrification. And so I think that we're all gonna see a lot more discussions around how do we move the needle on freight coming up more and more and more, because it's a heavy topic, pun intended. I couldn't help myself with the dad joke this morning. My 9-year-old would have rolled her eyes already. But background, the Electrification Coalition, if people aren't familiar, it's a national organization. We have a sister organization called SAFE that helped start the organization. But one of the things that is kind of different about us a little bit is that we focus on these issues because of the economic and national security impacts that our dependence on oil puts the U.S. in. And so, the transportation sector is the largest draw, right? 92 to 93% of our transportation sector requires oil to get from point A to point B. To use electrons to power that transportation sector, it is the greatest fuel diversity you can ever have. You could use solar panels, wind, you could use other fuels to power that. And so it really puts the U.S. in the best position if we're thinking about the transportation sector and the impact that it has on our economy and our national security. That's the best thing we can do, is plug a car in, plug a truck in, plug a bus in. The way that we work, though, is we kind of are in this interesting nexus of matching up direct implementation, real world programs with policy outcomes. And our experience is that by doing those sort of real world programs, we get our hands dirty. We work directly with the full ecosystem, and we start to have a much greater understanding of what are the policy mechanisms that are going to be needed to accelerate the adoption of plug-in electric vehicles. So then, if I was to boil that down, our mission is to accelerate to create the policies and actions that are going to accelerate the adoption of plug-in electric vehicles across the country. We're sort of a small but mighty team, and I guess it's sort of a sales pitch, but we're actually hiring for a senior director of EV programs. So if anybody thinks that's a job they'd be interested in, please let me know. But we really have done a few things. So we work at the local, state, and federal level. And on the city side, we have created something called the Climate Mayors EV Purchasing Collaborative. So it's an effort with Climate Mayors, which is this collection of 450 plus mayors that represent more than 80 million Americans across the country. But basically to develop an aggregated purchasing model for transportation electrification. And it started with light duty vehicles, and then has quickly scaled up to include medium and heavy duty, school buses, et cetera. And that's called the EV Purchasing Collaborative. We also then work on the American Cities Climate Challenge that's funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies. And the goal there is to work with 25 of the sort of nation's most aggressive cities. How you define that is a good question, but on transportation electrification. And so those include things like ubiquitous infrastructure development, fleet electrification, but also a lot of policy work. And then we also helped run on behalf of Paul G. Allen Philanthropies, the Smart City Challenge. So we've done a ton of city work. Then you also take that and we've launched a state policy accelerator. Jamie's actually been a great participant on some of those calls where we're working at in Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina to develop sort of a much more robust and aggressive policy action in those states to drive transportation electrification on all sectors. And then we work at the federal level on the policy side, and a big part of that is the idea that we wrote recently a paper called Commanding Heights, and the point of this is that there's we're sort of losing traction to China on a lot of the industrial side, and so really the U.S. needs to think more aggressively about the policies that we put in place to drive transportation electrification, so that we can maintain the incredible skills and ingenuity and American innovation that exists in the U.S. To be a part of what the transportation future is going to be, which is electrification. I'll wrap up and quickly say We also have launched a freight electrification effort, and it's this pilots to scale kind of thing. So on that front, we are actually partnering, and we just announced it a couple of weeks ago that we'll be partnering with Nestle. We're kind of all dropping names of major corporations that are engaging in the space, which I think is really exciting. And it's great that they're all sort of running to do this stuff and know that they need to start figuring it out. But we'll be working with them to develop one of their first freight pilot programs in Ohio. I think, sort of non-California focused efforts is by intention, in the idea that California has really been a leader on the policy space on this issue. But the other states really need to start figuring it out. And so we wanted to do a pilot outside of California to really push the idea of what kind of policies need to exist. We'll also be working with some other major companies that we'll get to announce in the coming months around some freight electrification efforts. And then we also just released a paper, which is available on our website, that talks a little bit about what are the pathways that need to exist in the marketplace. So I will stop, and I'm sorry if I went a little long.
You did not. That was great. And wow, I thought I knew everything that you're up to, but I clearly did not. You guys are busy. That's exciting. I think it'll be good later to get a little bit into, U.S. leadership and your commanding heights work, and sort of how can we seize this moment. But first, I want to give Eileen a chance to introduce herself. So Eileen Tutt of the California Electric Transportation Coalition, another person who I see as a real leader in this space, has been at this for a long time. I think despite the California-centric name, I certainly see Eileen engaging outside of the state here and there. She's got history in state government, has worked on this problem from all different angles, and is really closely tied in with utilities. So I think Eileen brings some really deep expertise on the utility and grid side of things. And Eileen, I hope you can speak a little bit about the challenges and opportunities from a grid and energy perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. It's a pleasure to be here this morning in California. But my name is Eileen Tutt. I'm with the California Electric Transportation Coalition, and as Jamie indicated, we do actually quite a bit of work outside of California, although we really focus on California. We are a nonprofit, and as Jamie indicated, our board includes is represented almost every of the 40 plus utilities in California, whether they be municipal, local, or investor-owned, large, medium, small utilities. Our members also include automakers and charging infrastructure providers, among others. We see, and Ben kind of alluded to this, but we see a tremendous, not just an environmental, climate change and air quality perspective, benefits from connecting the vehicle to the grid and using electricity fuel rather than oil. We also see this as a real opportunity to not just bring down the cost of electricity for everyone, whether or not you drive an electric car or truck or last mile delivery van, but also to benefit the grid in ways that we need to with the challenges and the sort of unnatural events that are happening as a result of climate change induced by human behavior. So in California, obviously, we've had just devastating, deadly wildfires, but we've seen unprecedented events like the first ever land-based hurricanes in Midwest and horrible. I mean, we're having a massive storm on the East Coast. I hope you're okay, Carol Lee. But these kinds of extreme weather events really do impact our access to electricity fuel, not just for the transportation sector, but for our homes and our businesses. And so when we connect mobility options, including last mile, and I want to point out something Jamie said, and that is that, in my neighborhood, and I think all of us have seen this, they're not just vans. I mean, I saw the other day a Kia Soul pulled up, and this woman in a FedEx thing, it was completely unwrapped and everything. She just got out and delivered a package. And so the creativity that's happening in the last mile world creates opportunities to not just electrify the vehicles and protect the air quality in these communities, but also to benefit the grid in ways that will help us deal with the extreme events that are happening as a result of climate change. So at CalETC, we have done quite a bit of research looking at sort of the impacts of connecting this mobility to the grid in terms of electricity costs, in terms of environmental benefits, whether it be combating air pollution or climate change pollution, and then also deep dive into what are the infrastructure needs associated with these vehicles. And in the last mile delivery, it's particularly interesting because you not only have quite a few people now that are driving their own personal vehicles and then charging at home or using public charging, but then you also have the fleets, the large fleets, the FedEx and big fleets. And so there's this opportunity to electrify in ways, again, that can really benefit the electricity grid. And that doesn't just impact California. Those benefits can accrue across the country as we adjust and adapt to the new normal as a result of not just the pandemic, obviously, but also climate change. So appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I'll turn it back to Jamie to start the dialogue.
Thanks, Eileen. So I think we can get to the Q&A now. I'm going to try to reserve some time throughout this for a question or two from the audience. So we've actually gotten a few already, but for those who didn't see this, if you open the Q&A window at the bottom, you can send in questions there. One question that came in so far, and I was going to address this in my intro, is the role of hydrogen. I think that a lot of the focus in this last mile sector, at least to date, given the state of these technologies, has been on the battery electric side, but that does not at all, in my mind, mean that that's the only path forward here. So certainly if anyone has thoughts on hydrogen throughout, feel free to jump in. The infrastructure challenges there are a little bit different, but a lot of the challenges around total cost of ownership and upfront costs and whatnot are the same. So definitely want to have an inclusive conversation to the extent that you want to work hydrogen into the discussion. I certainly see that as part of this. So I want to start by going a little bit deeper on something that Eileen was just talking about, which is one of the most obvious challenges, but I think also one of the most interesting, and that's charging infrastructure. How do we do this? I think all of your organizations have put out reports in recent years. Actually, I think you've all put out reports this year highlighting the infrastructure challenge as something that needs attention. And I would be curious to hear a little bit about what you're hearing from fleets and manufacturers on how we meet these needs. How do we get the infrastructure out there? How do we speed up deployment? How do we bring down the costs? And what do you do, for example, for a fleet that leases their facility and doesn't own it and may be somewhat limited in their ability to do these major sorts of upgrades? So I was going to start with Carol Lee, given a report out of the Corporate EV Alliance, but if that works for you, do you want to take first crack?
I'm happy to jump in there. And of course, charging infrastructure and the relationship with utilities is a huge issue. And luckily, Eileen is there on this. But we put out a report last May that focused specifically on utility, what corporations and fleet that were interested in electrifying their fleets wanted from utilities. And yesterday, we also announced the SEVA principles, which also touched on this as well. And just to summarize, I think, and I think we'll probably hear these themes over and over, that corporations are interested in access to cost-effective charging infrastructure, improved coordination with the utilities, strategically sited and widely available infrastructure, streamlining of charging stations, et cetera. One interesting common theme that we heard both from SEVA members and in this survey we did last May was that they wanted to use renewable energy. And that kind of goes back to the theme of companies that are driven by reducing their carbon footprint as well.
And I can follow up if that's all right. I just want to say that in the last mile delivery space, this is a particularly interesting space in terms of charging infrastructure because you not only have the opportunity to address the home charging infrastructure challenges, but also fleet charging. So you have commercial and residential charging, because many of these last mile delivery trucks and cars go back to their home at night. And so I think we did a pretty extensive assessment on the light duty side, and then on the medium and heavy duty side on the infrastructure need for these vehicles, and really looking at it from the perspective of the grid opportunities. And on the medium and heavy duty side, the interesting thing is, because we went all the way down to do 2B class trucks, which are these smaller delivery vans and trucks. And the crossover between residential charging and commercial fleet charging, it provides a tremendous opportunity. And in the fleet charging infrastructure particularly, you can connect to the grid in ways that benefit both the person charging and the fleet operator and the grid, and it helps to keep electricity fuel much cheaper. I do see this last mile challenge on the infrastructure side is unique, because it crosses between both the residential challenge and the fleet challenge of making sure that there's charging infrastructure. And to be honest, you can't electrify these trucks and cars without the charging infrastructure being in place beforehand. So once you deliver the car or truck, if they don't have access to charging and they can't use it, it's no benefit. So unlike those of us who drive our cars and maybe plug in with a level 1 charger that is in the back of your trunk when you buy your electric car, for these trucks, these last mile trucks, the infrastructure has to be there before the truck is even delivered. So we've been extensively evaluating what the need is there. I want to just give a quick shout out to the benefits of hydrogen. I don't really see hydrogen in the last mile delivery van arena or car, but I think there are tremendous opportunities. And we can look to China, who is definitely leading in ahead of California, ahead of the US in this world. And the opportunities to electrify the larger trucks using hydrogen fuel are tremendous. And they also provide grid benefits, because hydrogen is a source that can store the electricity and then be used. So you can create renewable hydrogen and then use it as a storage benefit for the grid, and then use that hydrogen in these big trucks. So that's where we are kind of looking for hydrogen in this world, but appreciate somebody bringing that up, because I think it's an important question. It is related to battery and the grid as well. It's not just battery electric vehicles that benefit the grid.
Looks like Meredith wants to jump in as well.
Yeah, one thing, I mean, just adding on, obviously agree with everything Eileen said. Something I forgot to say in my intro about the TCO of these vehicles is that their battery size is pretty moderate, like 120 kilowatts, which is only double what's in my Kia Niro. So, smaller batteries than other medium and heavy duty compared to their weight, and a driving range of like 120, 150 miles a day. So we're seeing that a lot of these vehicles right now, in the phase of adoption that we're in, they're using level 2 charging, which is good because it's cheaper. And while there's only a few vehicles, the likelihood of needing grid upgrades is much lower. But as the fleets really increase, and as we get density of vehicles parked at the same warehouse, that's when we're going to need, major grid upgrades and delivery. Companies may choose to go to DC fast charging, but probably not above 50 kilowatts. So at least we don't have those intense charging needs like transit buses or other heavy duty vehicles. And so, but I think adding on to what Carolee and Eileen said, we are seeing across the country that fleets want to buy these vehicles, but that their utilities and their utility commissions may not understand that this is real and it's really happening. And something we've been working on seeding outside of California is the idea that we need utility make-ready support for these vehicles. And as you said, we need it before they're even ordered. And it just, the sense we get is a lot of commissions are still in a place, a lot of utilities commissions are still in a place where they're thinking about light duty charging and maybe DC fast charging for public use, but not quite thinking about programs for fleets or rate design for fleets. And we really do think that we need thoughtful rate analysis based on, the actual usage cycle of these vehicles to make sure that charging them is cheaper than diesel or gasoline. And so that's something we're really focused on again in states like New York and in the Midwest.
Maybe just one little small ad, because I think you all have brought up, like you've painted a really great picture of the challenges that exist in some of the policy mechanisms. I think, there's still a lot around any of these companies, even some that are really aggressive. So, somebody like IKEA, right? They've made a commitment to say, we're going to go full electric in New York and LA and then 3 other cities internationally. There are just things that we don't realize until we start to dig into this that are going to be a challenge. Like IKEA doesn't own their vehicles, right? So like Eileen, you brought that up a little bit, but it's like you get into these issues around, these are owner operator vehicles. How do you support them who maybe don't have access to a lot of capital? They're already deep into their existing vehicle. How do you support them in a way that's going to allow them to transition quickly to meet those kinds of goals? IKEA doesn't want to own stuff, so they have to think about like, okay, at our facilities, we have to put in infrastructure to support those vehicles. So even if we want them to do it, we have to allow them to charge like while the vehicles are being loaded, pardon me. And so there's just all these sort of things that start coming up in the supply chain and the dynamics of infrastructure and charging that you just don't realize until you actually try to like put it into practice. And then my last quick thing is, there's a lot of real interest from companies like Nestle and others, but like a lot of their fleet managers have spent their entire life being, turning wrenches. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it like that's been their responsibility, is keeping those vehicles in operation and figuring out how to buy the next truck that meets the operational need. And so this is like a big deal to go through, like, you have to have, rethink an electrical engineering degree moment, right? And it's not quite that dramatic, but it does create some early stage challenges. And I think fleet managers or procurement officials get the idea of the vehicles, but infrastructure is like just a whole new thing that they just don't, like, they don't talk to the electric utility normally. That's not even a thing that they would think of that exists in their operational profile. So I think that's why there's a lot of help that's needed and really policy opportunities to help solve some of those problems.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I think you're totally right that as we start to do this, you realize that every facility and every fleet is a little bit different. And so there was a question that came into the Q&A about whether fleets want to own or lease. And I think every fleet's a little bit different. Every facility may be different. The cost and timeline for putting in infrastructure is going to vary from place to place. Your rate options and the potential support you can get from your utility will vary from place to place. So Meredith brought up a few things that can help with the total cost of ownership. If we can figure out how to bring down the cost of infrastructure deployment and speed it up. Meredith talked about make-ready programs. In California, a lot of the utilities have gotten permission to move ahead with programs where they can build out, some of that infrastructure on behalf of the fleet and kind of make this a more affordable business proposition. Meredith also talked about rate design and making sure that we have electricity rates that align with fleet needs and can allow them to keep their costs down. One question that came in through the chat is, beyond this utility engagement, utility programs, and rate design, what are the other most important policy levers that we need to be thinking about to solve the infrastructure challenge, recognizing that there is no one size fits all. You've got fleets that own their facilities, fleets that don't, fleets that need higher power charging, fleets that don't. So what else do we need in the toolbox to solve the infrastructure challenge and make this easier for a fleet?
Great. I'm happy to go, or was that directed at someone specifically? Sorry, Jamie.
No, that's directed at, I feel like all of you have ideas, so I just thought I would throw that one out.
I'll jump in. I think one is just there's like the soft costs, right? Which are like the biggest challenge that are like it can drive the budget out of control in developing infrastructure at a facility or even depot based, like start charging out in the wild, so to speak. And it's the idea that like soft costs basically means like all the permitting and like construction costs that go into developing the sites. And so, like right now we have this sort of patchwork of codes and regulations that exist across the country There's some sort of leveling that happens through international codes that, you know, like communities adopt, but there's also lots of home rule, which means basically any like city or county can like have their own plan for how they're going to deal with some of this stuff. And that makes it really tough to do this as something that is, you know, it's not pro forma, right? And so it means if I have $1 million to build charging and I have to blow $350,000 of it on permitting and this sort of stuff, like all of a sudden my budget to build out infrastructure is way less, and my plan and ability to meet the infrastructure needs for my operations are way less. So I think that that's a policy opportunity, and it's really developing out the make ready, which we've already talked about a little bit, but it's also potentially fast tracking permits that are focused around transportation electrification. Because one of the things right now is like in some ways these permits get put in line in the same way that any new service request is put in for electrification. And a lot of times the service request models are developed around building a building, right? And it's like, it makes sense. It's going to take years to build a building and there's all this stuff. And so it's okay that the service might not be there for a year. That's not okay if you're going to put in charging stations and, you know, you're saying we're going to start flipping our fleet over. You really need those service requests to kind of get front loaded. And I think there's some policy opportunities there. I'll stop there because I'm sure other people have really brilliant ideas that are smarter than that. But anyways. It's a good starting point.
Go ahead, Meredith.
Eileen.
Go ahead, Meredith. I'll look after you.
One thing that comes to the top of my mind, you know, I think you're asking about things other than utility programs, but we really do see that utilities are playing this key role in fleet advisory services and helping them plan not just their short-term, but their long-term plans for their fleet and avoid, you know, throwaway infrastructure by upgrading a depot for a couple vans and then you're planning to go to 100. So, you know, not to overemphasize them, but we really do see that as a key role of utilities. And I think to your point about the leasing model, that the potential overwhelming nature of this infrastructure need is leading a lot of companies to look at leasing, and not just leasing vehicles, but also leasing the chargers and outsourcing the infrastructure to a company that will then basically provide it back to them at a reasonable rate. So we see both of those as helping to solve this problem for fleets. But again, just that the utility is a very critical partner. And there are also important incentives. We think it is important to give some customer side incentives for the chargers. California will be launching a customer side incentive for infrastructure for medium and heavy duty soon. And obviously the role of federal tax credits for infrastructure is also really important.
And I would just second the important role of incentives and public investment in infrastructure cannot be underestimated, particularly when it comes to medium and heavy duty trucks and buses and equipment and last mile delivery. I do think that it's more than just incentives. They need to be adequate and they need to be reliable. And we have really fallen down on that in California. It's just, there is a program that's adequate, not really adequate, but it's certainly reliable in the Clean Transportation Program run out of the California Energy Commission. And that is about to sunset. And so we need to get that reauthorized for sure. So we have, again, adequate and reliable. On the vehicle side, California has a dismal record of adequate and reliable investment and incentives, and that has demonstrated it has impacted the market. So I can't underestimate that the amount of private sector investment in this space is massive. The economic opportunities are massive, and the state is not investing. And I see that across the country. I think New Jersey is an exceptional example of where incentives really are adequate and reliable, and they recognize the public benefit of making these investments. But certainly California has not met the criteria of adequate and reliable investment over the last decade, and I'm hoping that the next decade that will be changed. I do think that also the utility investments are essential in another area where I don't think California has adequately allowed the utilities to make these investments. And from the state perspective, as Meredith said, the California Public Utilities Commission, or utilities commissions, are very active here, and they're kind of the economic regulators of the investor-owned utilities. And what they're used to doing is just looking at what are the impacts on rates. And they don't look long-term, and they don't look at the environmental and climate change impacts of electrification. So we've just got to get these economic regulators, just like you're linking mobility to the grid. We need the regulator linked to the climate change, the economic regulator also recognizing the criteria pollutant, air quality, and climate change pollutant benefits of going electric, and we don't have that yet. So those are to me the two most important things that are needed, not just in California where it is just simply not happening, but also in the rest of the country.
One other real quick thing maybe is, and I should have said before, is also just a lot of delivery stuff is in disadvantaged communities, drives through disadvantaged communities, low-income communities. And so, this is one of these places where the equity needs to really be a big part of the conversation and some of the policy opportunities. And so what a great moment when we can really think through and do something that's actually going to help reduce air quality impacts in some of the most affected communities. And, freight and delivery of goods and services is like this, perfect opportunity to make sure that we do that in a way that's going to work in those communities first, potentially.
Yep. Great point, Ben. And, you have the added benefit of quieter operation in these dense urban areas. I think, we all need a bit of calm these days. And I think quieting down the trucks that are running around would be welcome. So I think we can potentially, toward the end, come back to some of this grid and infrastructure stuff, but I want to talk a little bit about the vehicles themselves. The upfront cost, at least now, is just higher. And so I want to talk a little bit about incentives and sort of how do we build this market. I think both Meredith and Carol Lee talked about there being a lot of pent-up demand, yet we're still at a point with a lot of these fleets where the upfront cost, even if there is a payback over the life of the vehicle, the upfront cost, I think, causes some hesitation. And CalSTART in particular has long advocated for purchase incentives. I know you run some purchase incentive programs around the country, so I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about your thinking on incentives and sort of the outlook there. And now that we are looking ahead at a new administration in Washington, is there a potential for some meaningful incentives at the federal level? Because this state level patchwork can only take us so far.
Thank you, Jamie. Happy to speak to that. And I apologize, I have a very persistent terrier here. Keeps wanting to come in and out of my office. So really quickly, I think your last question, at the federal level, there is a great potential, we think, not only with this new administration, but we think maybe bipartisan support for incentives and a national voucher program, such as the one we have in California. We do think vouchers or cash on the hood is really important for this industry and moves the market much more efficiently. But we also think it's critical that the incentives are certain, and that is not what we've had in California, unfortunately. We don't have funding yet we will have funding as of next week and hope to have HVIP be available in the spring. That's our heavy duty incentive here in California. But the last time we were able to open the list was over a year ago, and all the funds were spent in 2 weeks, or promised in 2 weeks. And just for reference, for a van 2B and 3, the incentive is $25K, and for the larger class 4 and 5, it's $50K. So we really think, it's important to have these incentives and to build the market, to show users that these vehicles work for them, and we need those early adopters to be, creating the lessons learned for everyone else. We do, of course, think that the market will continue to mature. Again, we're seeing these huge orders, but so far not huge deliveries yet. So what the beachhead envisions that we will graduate vehicle classes out of incentives as we reach some meaningful amount of market penetration. I don't think we've quite decided what that sweet spot is, but I think if we were able to sell 20 or 30% of vans in a year as electric, that in California, we would consider that a real win. and that incentives can decrease over time, and maybe for really mature market segments, that public support looks more like a low interest loan or some public financing for fleets that aren't FedEx and Amazon and UPS. And again, we are very hopeful, and I believe we are expecting to see a bill introduced at the federal, in Congress sometime this winter or early spring for a national incentive program.
So does anyone else want to jump in on this? I think, Carol, that was part of the principles that came out.
You really put your finger on a huge issue, Jamie, and the issue of the upfront cost parity with ICE vehicles. And that's been a recurring theme from the companies that we've been speaking to. In addition to the fact that they feel like there's a lack of a variety and volume of these vehicles and available models. And also they're looking for more certainty on the dates of when these models are actually coming out so they can plan forward. And that's all something we're definitely seeing a lot of progress in the sector, but that's something that our companies are seeing as lacking at this time. And moving to federal policy, I think there's certainly momentum behind multi-pollutant truck rules that will address not only climate but also health and equity issues as well. And we feel that policy is certainly important in driving, will be an important tool in driving electrification both at the federal and the state level.
I just have maybe it's a connected path is what I would say, which is there's a little bit of, we need to do more to develop the US supply chain and prioritize that. I think that there's a lot around, I opened the thing saying that we focus on the idea of oil dependency being an economic and national security issue. If we swap oil for batteries made overseas, we run into the same problem. And I think that it's sort of the responsibility of the U.S. manufacturing sector and the policy measures to really think about that, right? It's a minerals to market kind of thing. We need to do a better job of thinking about how do we actually develop and sell all of the parts of the supply chain. And I think medium and heavy duty vehicles are going to start to really put a bright light on that, just because of the opportunity to reduce our fuel needs, but also if we can build this stuff here and we can start thinking about how that helps reduce costs, I think it's going to make a big impact on some of the issues defined here. I also think we're going to see folks that have their global operations based here, Cummins, right, which is in Columbus, Indiana, right? They've been at the heart of building an internal combustion engine forever. They have a sector that's focused on transportation electrification. I think the more that we actually think of that as something that happens at the US level and there's policies and support to do that, we're going to see companies like that actually building more products and getting stuff out the door faster, even though it takes a while to sort of transition that manufacturing sector.
Great. So we've got a little more than 5 minutes left, and there are two questions that I still want to ask, and there are some good questions coming in the Q&A. We've addressed a lot of these, but you should all feel free to take a look at those as well. The first is, Eileen was talking about California, some of the incentive programs running out of funding and whatnot, but I think it's all relative. California has pushed further and faster than most regions and has really tried to take a holistic look. We've got, regulations sort of forcing these vehicles into the market. You've got hundreds of millions of dollars in approved utility programs to help build out the infrastructure. You've got a lot of focus on how to get the electricity rates right. We have a low carbon fuel standard, a policy that we haven't talked about yet, which basically creates an economic value for every kilowatt hour of charging and can help, make this total cost of ownership pencil out, particularly for a large and savvy fleet that wants to play in that market. You've got very large purchase incentives. And yes, in the COVID world, it's hard to fund these programs. But as Meredith said, $20,000 to $25,000 per vehicle for vans really moves the needle. And I'm not aware of anywhere else in this country anyway that has pushed that hard. Oh, and one other thing that's under consideration now is fleet purchase requirements. So CARB has been talking for a few years now about last mile delivery in particular, saying this is a great segment. we're going to require in some way fleets to buy these vehicles. So I guess, and you know, this is all managed by the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. Almost every agency in California is working in some way to try to move electrification forward. And I'm curious, because this cannot be just a California thing, we've now got several other states who have stepped up and said, we want to, you know, study a lot of this. We want to figure out which pieces of these we might be able to adopt. But realistically, what do you think this looks like outside of California? To what extent can some of the other states adopt all of these, or does this action really move to the federal level? Although the utility piece, I think, really has to stay state and local. But anyone have thoughts on to what extent some of these policies are exportable?
Well, to the degree that 15 states have signed on to that MOU that they want to adopt something like an advanced clean trucks rule, I mean, we're certainly sharing that. If they're serious about that, they need to be looking at complementary policies. And California was working on this for a long time before the advanced clean trucks rule was adopted. So I think there's quite a few states that need to get serious, and a few front runners like Massachusetts. New York already has a program, and Washington. We're hopeful about Texas, actually, not a 15-state signatory, but a huge market and a place where now some more zero-emission trucks are going to be built. So we're looking for legislation in Texas in 2021.
Yeah, I think there's certainly appetite among many of these states to move forward, and California is a great model.
And I would say, I mean, I honestly, I wish I could agree. I think California is a great model in that they're doing more than most other states. But the truth is that if you looked at California, like even the alternative clean trucks rule, it's great if you adopt that rule. But then if you don't adopt the complementary fleet rule, then it is destined to fail. And in addition, we have to have adequate incentives, and we don't. We have incentives programs in place, but they are stop and go. They consistently run out of money. That kind of market uncertainty, it helps the market a little, but not to the degree the public sector needs to be stepping up. So I want to, you know, I love my adopted state. And I'm very, very proud of what we've done. I think the one program that has been the most beneficial in California in terms of reliable and adequate incentives is the low carbon fuel standard. And that needs to go national as soon as possible, because what that does is it says the oil industry has to reduce the carbon content of the oil industry's fuel. It goes right to the economic issue here, which is we have a near total dependence. We are basically addicted to oil, and it is a monopoly fuel in the transportation sector. So we have to figure out how to cut into that basically monopoly market. And the low carbon fuel standard is the first policy that in my 30-year career I've ever seen that's actually been effective at doing that. And we have a new administration of the federal government. We need to have that kind of, and you know, Oregon adopted a clean fuels standard, which is New York's looking at a clean fuels standard. Washington's also considering it. The whole of Canada is looking at this, because we realize that what this does is it incentivizes fleets to purchase these vehicles, and it's made the transit industry in California they want to go 100% electric, because essentially the low carbon fuel standard credits that they generate mean that the fuel that they use is essentially free. And so I just want to say that is, if we could get a national or even just states would adopt these clean fuel policies and really that it creates investment in clean fuels rather than further investment in the carbon intensive oil, then that kind of a policy signal, it doesn't take any revenues, which is from public sector, which is part of the challenge here. Local governments don't have any money, state governments don't have any money right now, and I don't know how long it's going to take to come out of this economic recession, but we all need to recognize that there are other huge priorities as we recover from what has been an economic and public health disaster.
Yeah, I completely agree on the importance of the national low carbon fuel standard. And as to California, I know it's imperfect, but everything's relative.
So we have just under a minute left. I want to just finish with sort of a lightning round. Thank you, everyone. This has been really good, and I agree that there's a lot that we can learn from, and it's exciting to see states sort of raising their hand and the federal government thinking, all right, what can we do here? I want to end it just, a few seconds each. If we were to look back in 2030, where do you think we will be in terms of electrifying this sector, and what would you cite as kind of the thing that moved the needle the most?
I'll go. So I think, and it's good Eileen set the table. I think that, the idea that oil has monopoly and we can transition, and something like a low carbon fuel standard could be a definitive policy mechanism. I think that this is one of these things where I think we're going to move we're going to move slow and then suddenly move a lot faster, because I think it's like the manufacturing sector has to catch up. So I would love to see in that sort of 30%, 40%, but I think we have a long ways to go, and I think it's going to be a lot harder than we think.
All right. Anyone else? 10 seconds each.
I might be more positive, but I think by 2030, we really are going to see in our leading regions in the country, almost no gas or diesel delivery vehicles sold. The paybacks are just great, and we will have dealt with the rate issues and make ready. And I should also say, and we're doing vehicle grid integration at a massive scale.
And I would just say that the driver in 2030, we're going to be way further along, and that is because the climate change imperative is finally being recognized, and fortunately we will see that at the federal level too now.
Yeah, I think we'll see strong state and federal policies driving electrification, and I share this optimism about significant deployment of delivery electric vehicles.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. So yeah, we've got a lot of money pouring into the space, a lot of policy innovation. I think it's clear on the infrastructure and incentives and all this, we have a lot to do. We need to do it all, but I think it seems everyone on here is quite optimistic that we will be able to do that, and we'll see action across the country. So thanks everyone for joining us this morning, and thank you to all the speakers, and let's all get to work getting some of these things in place.
Thanks
everybody.
Thank you, Jamie.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.